Thank you very much, Jim, to Father Stephen, to Jerry for asking me along. It feels like an old school reunion when I look around the place. I see Paul Brown across here. Lived round the corner from us in East Belfast when East Belfast was not a good place to be when you were our age at that time. I was running for Willowfield Harriers at that stage. It was good to be able to run. Is another bit of learning from that period as well. I see Kieran Smith, Fergus Cooper, Stephen Graham. You know, had I known they were coming, I wouldn't have. But I'm glad Jim told me what I was here to speak about, because when I turn up at these events, I think it's much better to have a conversation with people rather than talk at you. And I'd said to Jerry when he gave me when he wrote to me first of all, and then when we spoke on the phone, I'd like to speak on this title, The Holy Grail of Truth. And truth is something that we talk a lot about. I think we should stop talking about truth. I know that's quite a controversial thing to say, but I say it in that way because whatever this process delivers and doesn't deliver, it will not deliver absolute truth from any side, never mind all of the sides. And controversially, a few years ago, I said it's time to stop lying about the truth. And what I meant by that was we need to be more honest about what is achievable. And in a process that we're in at the moment, we talk about everything being new. So we talk about new policing, we talk about the new peace, we talk about new politics. And what we're trying to do is build it on the old past. And I'm wondering, can anything really be new until we address the hardest question that we've avoided up to this point? That question of our past and what is achievable in terms of more information. If it's not absolute truth, what is the maximum amount of information we might be able to achieve? So when I came to write this book, Living with Ghosts, it was a book I had to think long and hard about, whether I was going to write it and when I might write it, if ever I was to write it. And during COVID, I was writing a book on our political situation at that stage, Stormont, and it's really great that things have started to settle and we can all look forward to a bright future. The Tories have sorted out their mess for a week or two, and then they're going to tell us how we sort out ours. But when I was writing Political Purgatory, I was sitting in the roof space, I think probably one morning at 3 or 4 in the morning, those mad things that you do when you're writing. You know, you write when everyone else is asleep. You look for a bit of quiet. And I asked myself, why am I doing this? You know, the bookshops are closed. The publishers are closed. We're all living in this period of restrictions. Why am I doing this? And I chatted to a lad called Kevin Comeny, the next day. Is it Comeny? Where's Alex? Andrew Muir. Kevin, who was at the Irish Secretariat. Kevin Comeny, isn't that right? Yeah, I've got it now. And he said to me, ring this lad, Conor Graham, at Marion Press. He'll be interested in your book. And the following day I rang Conor. Kevin had told me he had a Hollywood connection, although he'd been in Kildare for years. So I spoke to Conor and I said, Conor, this is what I'm doing. We agreed on the book. And I said to him, tell me about your Hollywood connection, would you? He said, there's not many of us left, Barney, but he says, my father was Tony. I asked him, did he live at 29 Wood End? He said, how do you know that? I said, well, when we were intimidated out of our home, and I was asking Paul this just in the porch, I think sometime late 1973, maybe early 1974, Paul and his family had to run a few months earlier, I think. As Conor and his family, the Grahams, left Wood End, we moved in. We moved in to 29 Wood End, where my mother still lives, 92 a few weeks ago. And it was one of those little dots that, you know, remarkable dots in this small place that join you up. So Conor published Political Purgatory. He came to me then just a few months later in December last year, and he said to me, would you write us another book? And I said, depends what it is. He says, I'd like you to write a memoir. I said, would you catch yourself on? He said, far too grand for me, that sort of caper. A memoir, I leave that to others. I said, there is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, thinking more about it more recently. I'd like to write a personal reflection of reporting the conflict period into the piece. And I said to him, if you're interested in that, that's what I will do. And we signed off on that, I think, on January the 20th, just this year, and I gave him the manuscript at the start of March. It was a book that had been looking to run out of me, if you like, for escape from me to get rid of it, whatever way you want to describe it, for quite a number of years. And what I wanted to do was to explain to people what they didn't see. So they saw me on the news, they heard me on the radio, they read some of the stuff that I wrote. I remember Anne-Marie's mum saying to me one day, I hate those words on the radio in the morning. I said, what are they? She says, Rowan reports. She says, always bad news. And it was quite often bad news in those days. But what people, I suppose, didn't see in all of that was the story behind the story, how I came to have the information that I shared on radio and television, what I didn't share on radio and television, at that time. And so that's the book that I decided to write. And I said at a recent event in Holywood, hundreds of journalists reported the Northern Ireland conflict. They were to scenes of great horror on many occasions. What was different about the job that I did was I had to put myself beside the people who were creating the scenes. So I had to establish relationships with the IRA organisation, with the loyalist organisations, with the spooks, military, police, political leaders, those who had the pulse of many communities, across the churches on different occasions. And that's the kind of rewind button that I've been pressing inside myself for quite a number of years now. Playing back into those numerous conversations I had with people, how I reported that information, what I got right, what I got wrong, what I could have done better, the pressures that I brought home with me, looking under my wife's car many mornings, telling the kids who were much younger at that stage that I was looking for the cat, when clearly I was looking for something else. The horror when I told Elle, my daughter, many years later what I was actually looking for. Sense of disbelief that that's the kind of life that we had to lead. But I think if we are going to try to answer the past, and I think we have to try to answer it as best we can, then we need to ask the questions of ourselves before we ask them of anyone else. I'm not interested in a blame game, that you were right and I was wrong, that we won and you lost. That's not what I'm interested in. And I think the huge challenge for our generation, the conflict generation, is to let go. We hold on to things as if we own them. Hold on to the ceasefires. The ceasefires are ours, And, I remember the morning in August 1994, a woman from the IRA reading the ceasefire statement to me in a cafeteria in West Belfast. That cafeteria at that stage being run by Jerry Moynes from Holywood. The woman reading this sentence about there being a complete cessation of military operations from midnight that night. And me thinking to myself, I wonder what that is. I wonder what a complete cessation of military operations really means, because we had fallen into the routine of the conflict period, or those troubled years, what I think was a war. And, some people, get annoyed when you describe it as a war, but with thousands of soldiers here, with bombs going off, with people being shot dead, and we called it the Troubles. I'm sorry for your troubles. Catch yourselves on. It was something much more than that, something bigger than that. And I also hold the view that it didn't just happen. We're all very comfortable when we talk about what happened. We're not so comfortable when we're asked, why did it happen? Something happened to make it happen. And that's something that we need to explore as well. And when we explore that, excavate that, try to dig it all up, it becomes all the more challenging and all the more difficult. But one of the things that I write in the book is about how we all became dehumanized in the conflict period. We got used to war. The news in the morning went in one ear and out the other. We listened when, on occasions, we were shocked by the number of people who were killed in a particular incident. But those who died on their own were forgotten almost as soon as they were remembered. And so I've gone back and looked at how I reported all of that, the mechanical way we reported it, what time the bomb went off, how many people were injured, how many people died. Such a mechanical, impersonal, routine way of dealing with what was happening around us. And I remember 1992, when we were approaching the point of 3,000 deaths in the conflict. The BBC asked me to prepare reports for radio and television to mark that moment in the conflict period. I interviewed 4 people. I interviewed Martin McGuinness. I interviewed William Smith, who chaired the Loyalist Ceasefire News Conference 2 years later in 1994. I interviewed Dr. Jack Weir, who had been a Presbyterian moderator, spoke to the IRA in the 1970s, tried with other people from a church background, trying to make the argument to end the conflict period. And I interviewed Bishop Eddie Daly. They're all gone. They're no longer with us. And across the frame, we're losing so much of that critical memory, truth that people talk about. But Jack Weir, at that stage, he had Parkinson's. And he had scribbled a little note in preparation for the interview that he was going to do with me. This is it. So 1992, so it's 30 years old. I want to read you a couple of sentences from it, a couple of paragraphs, just to let you hear what Jack was thinking about at that time. He said, "No shooting or bombing or intimidation should be seen by anyone as a successful operation, but rather as a failure, that we have not found a better way. Whether we're thinking as loyalists or Republicans, unionists or nationalists, security forces or politicians, or most of all, as the plain people of this province, who have not risen up to cry above all else, 'Stop it now,' but have been content to carry on our lives as long as we don't feel involved. But we are involved. For violence and all that leads to and that goes with it doesn't start with the finger on the trigger or the hand that lays the bomb. But it starts in people's hearts and minds, in our ambitions and our attitudes to one another. We are all involved. As John Donne said, 'No man is an island. Any man's death diminishes me. And therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee and for me 3,000 times.'" So that became part of the news coverage in 1992. But when I read it now, I missed the point in 1992. This was a man who was ahead of the political posse, saying to us that we're all involved. We may not be pulling triggers, we may not be putting down bombs, but in that sense of becoming dehumanized and falling into the routine of it all, becoming numb, dare I say, becoming bored with it all, we had taken steps back rather than steps forward in trying to bring some end to that conflict period. Jack Weir was one of those individual clergy, like Father Reid from Clonard, who stepped out from the institutions of the churches to try to make a difference. The churches, I think, by and large, were prepared to preach condemnation from the pulpits rather than take meaningful steps, hard steps that may have brought some of this to an end before we eventually got there in that developing process. But Jack's no longer with us. Alec Reid's no longer with us. Roy McGee, who did so much on the loyalist side, no longer with us. The quiet peacemakers behind the politicians who made an effort. But one of the other things I came across when I was scribbling the book was I've come to know Colin Davidson quite well, the artist Colin Davidson, who's painted so many of the world's big names in politics: Clinton, McGuinness here, Trimble, most recently the portrait unveiled, Ed Sheeran, Brad Pitt. But he painted Silent Testimony, 18 portraits that were to tell the story not of the past, but of the present. People who had suffered the worst horrors of conflict and still live with them today. So we talk about a past, and for many people it's right now. And one of the people that Colin painted was a man called Paul Riley. And Paul's daughter was killed in a bomb in April 1989. I went back into an archive I keep, and I found my reports from 1989. And I shared them with Colin, not just the reports. We worked on typewriters at that stage, but the IRA statement from that morning, how I started to report the bomb at 11 o'clock that morning. The bomb had gone off at 2 minutes to 10. Statements from the chief constable, sent by fax at that stage, and the mad lack of communication and ways of communication we had then. Some of it fading, because it is so old. And I sent it to Colin and I said, Colin, would you have a look at that? And would you maybe give me a few thoughts that fill in the gap that's in that report, or those reports that I made that morning? It was reported as another IRA mistake, a bomb that wasn't meant to kill Joanne Riley. And I'd looked at a series of statements, obviously, before I made those reports in 1989, back to Enniskillen, the Enniskillen bomb of 1987. The first statement I took from the IRA was the day after the Enniskillen bomb in 1987. There had been something like 28 or 29 of these so-called mistakes in that period from late 1987 to April 1989. And I started to think, when's a mistake not a mistake? When you keep repeating it. And so I think one of the truths that the IRA has to get to is that those bombs were not mistakes. Joanne Riley may not have been the intended target that morning, but when you put a bomb in a town centre massive amount of explosives in it, then you know that you're running the risk, the possibility, the probability of killing civilians. So Colin, I'm just going to read you the words that Colin wrote. As I say, the missing pieces, the missing words from the news reports of 1989. I said, Colin Davidson has thought about some words. They are a journey from my impersonal news scripts in the hours of the bomb into a very human and personal story. Words that today stand tall as a kind and thoughtful expression of how the dead should be remembered. I've said it before and I repeat it here. Davidson paints with brushes and he paints with words. And these are Colin's words. Joanne Riley would have been my age. I painted her father Paul in 2015, the sitting having taken place in her bedroom in their house in Warren Point. Paul had been a school caretaker, and I remember him telling me hearing the bomb explode. It sounded like a door closing, he said. In so many ways, that's exactly what it was for Paul and his wife Anne. Every door closing, never to be reopened. For the rest of us, the sanitized news reports at the time told a familiar story of another so-called mistake, of someone being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the fact is that Joanne was in the right place at the right time. She was in her place of work at 9:58 a.m. that morning. It was the human beings who drove that van and armed the device who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, as if they had a higher right to be there than Joanne. When I read the news notes now, I am transported to the bedroom in Warren Point, probably hastily left that morning in a rush to start a day's work. And I think of Paul, who heard a sound like a door closing. And then I write, these 30 plus years later, Colin has given us the missing words from that day in April 1989. 3 in particular. A door closing. How remarkably simple yet profound. A sound of war, of a news report, of that bomb that day. Something the IRA should think about now. There were 150 plus words in the statement of explanation and sincerest apologies. Yet that moment is captured in just 3. That closing door, heard that day, and I'm sure on the many other days of the so-called mistakes. Part of an IRA truth could be to acknowledge the doors that were closed as the inevitable consequences of such actions. So when you dig, when you go back, when you review, when you rewind, when you reflect, you find all of these new questions. New to me, questions for me, questions for many others. So there are many truths to be explored on that Holy Grail. Collusion, security force involvement with agents and in killings. How loyalists labelled people when they shot them dead. And while you can't bring back the dead, you can give families the truth of the lie. You know, that people were shot not because they were in the IRA or the INLA. They were shot in many and most of those instances because they were Catholics. And the many truths then that the IRA have to come to terms with. One of them about how bodies were disappeared. You know, I took those statements from the IRA when they said that they had identified the whereabouts of a number of the graves of the disappeared. Some of those searches continue. For Columba McVeigh, most recently. And I remember sitting in the back of this church, 2009, taking a call from the IRA. It must have been a Monday. It could have been a Sunday. It is a Sunday, actually. So I went outside and I picked up the church bulletin from 2009. Father Peter O'Kane. I came into the back of the church and I borrowed a pen, and I scribbled on the back of it an IRA statement, denying that organisationally they had disappeared this man, Peter Wilson. But Peter Wilson's name then got added to the original list from 2009. So there are these thousands of pieces that sit in my house, written on all sorts of things, that are a reminder of where we were. But I think what they also tell me is we're in a better place. I'm not going to take those statements anymore. You know, our news every day is not about people being killed. Our news, most recently, is about political failure. How we've done the hard bit, and we don't know how to do the easier bits. You know, why is Stormont not sitting in a cost of living crisis? You know, when people are worried about buying food, heating their homes, their mortgages, Christmas is around the corner, and all of the costs associated with that. You know, to borrow a phrase from John Hume, you can't eat a sea border. You know, he said we couldn't eat a flag, nor can we drink a sea border. You know, we need to get beyond where we are. I'm very much of the view that we don't need an election post-October 28. That if Stormont fails this time, it should fail forever. We should move to the next conversation. A grown-up conversation about how we look after people. You know, govern in a way that is for people and that is not about individual political needs or demands. I see Kenny sitting here. You know, takes me back to another story. Kenny's daughter and my son, I think would they have been in the same P7 class? Kenny, I'm trying to think. So what year would that have been? Early 1990s? Would it? Is that right? Early 90s, mid-90s? I interviewed Kenny in Bestbrook, I think it was, you know, when he was based in Crossmaglen. And, you know, I remember my son saying to me, you know, they probably didn't know the detail of what I did at that stage and what Kenny did at that stage, but seeing the two of us on TV one night, you know, I think we may have been just trying to struggle our way out of the conflict period at that stage. So we've come a long journey. We've come a long way. We've a road yet to travel. We need saved from ourselves, and our politicians need saved from ourselves. And when I said that the conflict generation needs to let go, the ceasefires, the political agreements, the big reforms within policing, they weren't for us. They were for the next generation. They were for the people who came behind us, to allow them the space to shape the present and the future. And if we don't wise up, we're going to bury ourselves in the conflict period, and we're going to bury them in the conflict period. So I've said enough, probably said too much. I'm happy to take whatever questions you have and answer them as best I can. And there's no such thing as a stupid question, because I've asked them all before. You know, as I developed throughout that long journalistic career. Not quite the start of the Troubles, Jim. You know, you've added a few years on to me there. You know, to the BBC in 1984. You know, and beyond. So if anyone would like to ask a question, I'm happy to have a go at answering it. Don't be shy.
Brian, can I ask? I think you've been a bit hard on yourself. I think. I mean, having lived through the Troubles, and I go right back to start. Always one. Okay. The average response of the average person, the normal person, switching on the wireless every morning and hearing these horrible stories, brought courageously to us by people like yourself, were horrible to us. And you have a family, my kid's daughter. I didn't want to expose her to that. So my reaction was to shut the radio off and to keep myself away from that.
Yeah.
There were years when I didn't listen to Northern Ireland broadcasts
Yeah.
or watch Northern Irish television. And I insulated myself, my wife and from the trouble. That was my way of coping.
Yes.
Or you're probably going to say, well, you didn't cope, Jim. You chickened out. Well, maybe I did chicken out.
No. I'm not going to say that.
Okay. That was my way of coping.
Yeah.
I suspect a lot of people did exactly the same.
Well, look at recent events. That Russian invasion of Ukraine. I listened to every news bulletin for days. Listened to it and watched it round the clock, and then I had to switch it off. It becomes too much, and I think it became too much here. I'm not being hard on myself. I know that in my reporting career, Jim, I brought news to people that they never expected. Big moments, ceasefires. I've witnessed some remarkable events. So I don't set that to the side. I know the good bits, but the challenge to us all is to face the difficult bits, and that's what I'm doing in this book. I thought it was ready to write this book, Jim, and I found at an event in Ballycastle just a few weeks ago that I'm not as ready as I thought it was. Thrown by a question, ended up in a mess. Couldn't speak, struggled to answer. So there's one thing writing it down. It's another challenge to speak the next bit. But I mentioned the things that people don't see. I became very close to David Irvine, the loyalist politician. Some people thought that was strange. The fact that we kicked with different feet, but that I was a journalist and he was a politician, how could that be right? You go for a pint with him, he goes for a pint with you. And I said to people that we had built such a relationship at that stage, we could say anything to each other. And we did. There was much more honesty in that relationship than you will find in many relationships that exist between politicians and journalists. I was at his bedside shortly after he died. People would have known the relationship I had with him. So I remember walking in the corridor of the Royal Victoria Hospital just after he had died, and Gary Mason, the Methodist minister, was with us. And the big challenge in the peace process that stage was around policing. Should it be devolved to local politicians, or should it stay in London? And a number of the unionist politicians at that stage were saying, not in my political lifetime. And I turned to Gary Mason and I said to him, how long is a political lifetime? I'd spoken to this man on Saturday night. I'd got the call on Sunday that he was very ill, that he was in hospital, that he wasn't going to do. I went to the hospital, was there as he died. His wife asked us, my wife was with me, Val, to join them at the bedside. I didn't want to be there. I wanted to remember him the way I'd remembered him a few weeks earlier when we'd had a few pints together, and when he asked me to do the Christmas draw in some loyalist club, and I'd had my doubts about that. But as I was walking in that corridor of the Royal, the BBC rang me, and I did an interview for the BBC, and then Jane Lockery from Ulster Television was waiting for me outside. And the first call that I got when I finished those interviews was from a Republican, Jim Gibney, in Belfast. And he said to me that he and Tom Hartley, who had been the Sinn Féin Lord Mayor and who had made a film with David on the song, would like to go and see Jeanette, David's wife, in the Braniel estate. Could I ask Jeanette, would that be okay? And I asked Jeanette, and of course it was okay. And the next issue was then, how do we get these two Republicans from the Falls Road into the top of the Braniel estate? So I said to Jim, you and Tom stand at the front of the City Hall tomorrow morning and my wife will pick you up. I went to the Irvine house. Val drove the two of them to the Braniel. They came in. When they were there, a group of loyalists arrived. There was no reaction to their presence other than, thanks for being here. Thanks for coming. And when we were driving back then, they asked, could they go back by a different route? Val had taken them up the Albert Bridge Road, up the Upper Newton Arch Road and into the Braniel estate. Quite worrying, and quite a moment for two Republicans. So they were telling us that when they got back to the Falls Road, then they got a bit of a dressing down. They hadn't told people they were going. It wasn't a political decision, it was a spontaneous gesture. But as Tom Hartley explained in Holywood recently, he said again in West Belfast recently, the conversation then turned to, how were you received? And they said we were received well. And that then opened the path for Gerry Adams to attend David Irvine's funeral on the Newton Arch Road in 2007. Could it happen in 2022? Probably not. And that's what I mean about us pressing rewind buttons. You know, we made, I suppose when I looked at 2007, I thought that was the moment when I really believed we were getting close to peace. That, you know, these big gestures could happen. Not just that Adams went, but that the UVF leadership allowed him to be there, you know, is not something that should be understated as well. So, yes, I've witnessed those great moments that, you know, many years ago we would have thought impossible, unthinkable. But those are the easier stories to tell. The more difficult ones are some of those that I've dealt with earlier in the talk. Anyone else? Make a statement, yeah. 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 You shouldn't apologise for that. Yeah. Well, and I don't think we should ask anyone to forgive and forget. You know, I think what we've got to do is properly remember and find a way of doing that. I think some people confuse what they call a truth process with an apology process. They think truth is saying sorry. Truth might be not saying sorry. Might be expressing some regret. But I think our problem with all of that is we've had numerous processes trying to establish what we call a legacy structure, which began with Eames Bradley in 2007, right through to where we are today with UK government legislation, which is not about addressing the past, it's about shutting it down. You know, it's not about doing the right thing, it's doing the wrong thing. But what we've done in all of these processes is we've talked about a structure without thinking that we actually need to go and talk to the people who have the information to see if they're prepared to share it, how they're prepared to share it, what way that's done. So I liken it to, we're building houses that no one's going to buy. So I think we need an international process. We've needed international help with everything that we've done in this process. George Mitchell, US Senator for the politics, General de Chastelin, the Canadian General with the arms, Chris Patton, when it came to police reform. And yet we think that we can ask or answer the hardest question of all that relates to our past and our future, and do that on our own. We're kidding ourselves, and we're leading people up garden paths, and it is that lie of truth that I talk about. So I think that international team should be appointed, should come in. It should write the report of the last 50 years, the report of conflict and peace. Pardon? Well, it's up to people whether or not they want to read it, but well, and no one should be forced to read it, but what I'm saying is that report should be written with pens free of emotional ink. It can't be written by us. We're all too close to it. We're stitched into the fabric of it. You know, we all know someone who was either killed or injured. We don't forget that stuff. Many people will not forgive it, and nor should we demand that they forgive it. But this idea that we draw a line and move on, that's nonsense. There's no line thick enough to draw over or through or under our past. We have to address it some way, but I don't think we should just have that international team. I think we should have a place of proper remembrance. I think we should have statements of acknowledgement. The Reverend Harold Good is of the view that the churches should come out with their hands up first. I think they should all be in the room when we're discussing how they do that. The moderators, the archbishops, the cardinals, the presidents, the brigadiers, loyalist, IRA, military, the spooks, the police. And they should be kept in that room until we work out how we're doing this. We then think about what practical help we can give people. And we create a storytelling process where you can tell your story and I can tell mine. And I don't have to accept yours as truth and you don't have to accept mine as truth. All we have to accept is that's what you believe and that's what I believe. Now, can we get to that point? If we don't get to that point, there'd be somebody standing here in 50 years' time asking, why did we not do that? Why did we not try harder? We could have done better. So I think that challenge is still before us. I wouldn't ask anyone to forget and forgive. They don't forget, but they can forgive. Well, I mean, that's okay to say if you haven't got an empty chair at your table. So I don't believe we should be demanding forgiveness. I think a different kind of truth for people is acknowledgement. I've argued for a long time that we need an amnesty. We can't have a peace process that releases prisoners and then a past process that creates prisoners. So we need to get beyond that kind of justice element of court and jail into a frame where someone from outside of us works out for us. I mean, Colin Davidson painted those 18 portraits. 100,000 people went to the Ulster Museum to view them. It became a sacred space. Someone likened it to the Stations of the Cross. So these things can be imagined outside politics if only we're prepared to turn our mind to other possibilities. Some in politics still want to rerun the conflict years on a political stage in some pathetic play that tries to win something that can't be won. I'll leave that one there. Is there? Yeah, Jarth.
I want to compliment your book and your approach on the basis that you have started a process to allow us to rethink how we think about everything that we went through collectively.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we do need to rethink it all. For example, I disagree with you about the assembly.
Mm-hmm. I know. Yeah.
I think that we need to rethink how we do the assembly and how we use it. Because I think the assembly, for example, would be critical to that next big conversation we talk about.
Yeah.
And I think part of the difficulty that you've hit upon is the manner in which people fighting in the past weaponize the assembly in order to continue a battle. And that goes across all of the participants at the senior levels of politics. You talked about Jay Adams going to David Irvine's funeral, for example, which was a great gesture. A year earlier, Jay Adams didn't go to Dennis Donaldson's funeral,
Yes.
which was in his own community. And I think that confronting the need for honesty about the devastation of dignity that we were all either active or passive participants in is something that we haven't yet got to. And I think when you reframe the issue of truth, you're really getting at the kernel of what needs to happen next. We need an honesty process. Because honesty is something that we give to other people. Honesty is a choice. Honesty is not preventing any of the actors, the military actors, paramilitary actors, the political actors, from giving up what they could today as a formal, positive initiative to others. And rather than formalize processes, I think we need to start building up that ethic of honesty in the conversation. And I think that's where your book has started a really important process in society.
Yeah. And Jarlath, I would say that in conversations like this, and I've been involved in them for years, I hear much more what might be described as truth in those rooms than we'll ever hear in a truth commission. And I've witnessed that. And you make the point about Dennis, and I deal with that in the book, how differently Dennis and Freddie Scappaticci were dealt with. I know who did the most damage to the IRA organisation. Scappaticci did. He was managed out of Belfast. An escape route was created for him because for the IRA to acknowledge that Scappaticci was who people were saying he was, an agent working for the army at the heart of the IRA organisation, would have brought the next questions. Well then, who else? So I say in the book that there's little forgiveness in those situations. Dennis wasn't forgiven. Freddie Scappaticci may not have been forgiven, but he was given a route out, And so on your politics thing, when I say if Stormont fails, it should fail forever, I think we need to rethink the Stormont setup. It's too often a glass house for people to throw the bricks of the past within, People who shouldn't be throwing those bricks and who have no right to throw those bricks. But the whole essence of the peace process was politics working. It can't be politics not working, and it can't be politics half working. So if in its current frame it's not working, we need to have the next conversation about how that can be done better. And that shouldn't be beyond us, And I think you're absolutely right, that the more of these types of conversations that we have, then the more we learn about each other. Because in places like this, we've got to try to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And that's the hardest task. We spent 40 years in this place condemning each other. Now we have to think about talking to each other. And that's a completely different challenge.
Absolutely. And that issue of condemnation.
Mm-hmm.
I think you see when we rethink the conflict through the prism of human dignity rather than through the prism of our own political allegiances,
mm-hmm.
political lines that we have learned
Mm.
and created. When you rethink it like that, there is no impediment whatsoever to condemning every single atrocious aspect of conflict that we experience, from structured discrimination through to structural devastation of cities. Because condemning that in the prism of human dignity does not mean that you're condemning to damnation
Mm-hmm.
every single individual in this society who was involved or got caught up in it. Because ultimately, both our Christian background and our criminal justice ethic is one about rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm.
It's one about restitution.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're in a position where we can rehabilitate the politics of this society, then we ought to be in a position where we accept the rehabilitation of ourselves back into the space of human dignity. Those conversations, I don't think yet are even at on the radar
Yeah.
in formal politics.
Yeah.
But I do commend you for the book, because it is allowing this kind of conversation to start.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said throughout the room. But the one thing which nobody says, I don't know if people think it or not, but as long as other people pay, finance our 6 counties, Northern Ireland, as long as we are not required to pay ourselves for damages that we do, somebody else will always pay. And until we have to pay for the damage which is done, certainly in the future, I don't think anything will change.
Well, I think so much has changed. I think we're in a much better place. I do think we need to take much more responsibility ourselves, that we shouldn't always be looking for someone to hold our hand. I think we absolutely need someone to hold our hand on this big question of how we get from the past into some sort of present. But I think politically we're on a bend at the moment.
Don't we have to take responsibility for financing, particularly what people pay no attention to? They simply ask for more and more money, yet undermine every institution which is there.
Yeah, but the point, I suppose the point that I'm going to make, our politics is moving to the next big conversation. We're in the waiting room now of the next big conversation. Talk of a new Ireland is no longer dismissed as idle talk. I think we need to be careful about that conversation. I think we should not repeat the mistakes of Brexit. In other words, we should have the answers to questions before we ask them. But I know in conversations that I have about a new Ireland with all sorts of people, it's not about a flag. That's not what's going to determine for many people what a new Ireland might look like. It is on those issues about pensions and health and education. Is it economically viable? What is the transition period? What is there going to be a distinct northern entity within this new Ireland frame? what is culture, what is rights within that New Ireland frame. And the other thing that's being ignored in that conversation is that a border poll can neither be won by green or orange. That third pillar in our politics, which is now described as other, is going to determine the future of this place at some point when that question is asked. But I think in the nervousness of that conversation, that's part of the reason why politics isn't working. It's part of the reason why Stormont isn't working. Because if you look at the whole post-Brexit electoral trend, it's not really what I'm here to talk about, but I'm going to, at every step of the way, the 2017 Assembly election, Unionists lose their overall majority at Stormont. The 2019 European election, Naomi Long gets elected. Unionism loses its second seat. Probably the most strategic, tactical election of my lifetime in terms of people sitting down thinking about how do we get a second Remain candidate elected here, and you then go to the 2019 general election, Unionists no longer holding the majority of NI seats at Westminster, through to 2022, and Sinn Féin now the largest party at Stormont, and in every poll, the largest party across the border. For unionism, this is a moment of change that they're struggling to cope with. And I think we need to be careful with the conversation about the next steps. That doesn't mean we don't have it, but we have it in a sensible, proper frame. And I think part of that conversation, if that New Ireland conversation develops to some end point, that's where we're all going to have responsibility about what we spend and what we don't spend, how we use resource and don't use it, and they're not always being something to dip into when we get into trouble. You know, so many of the crises in the peace process have been resolved by money. You know, additional money for this, additional money for that. You know, I'm not saying this is my term, but someone has, used the term about buying a dirty peace. You know, and so we've made good progress. We're in a better place. I've witnessed remarkable change. We've all witnessed remarkable change. There is much more still to do. Paul, you're very quiet. Not like it.
Read your book, Brian. Very much. Trust me, the truth that you tell is the fact that you accurately recorded an incident that you and I both experienced.
Yeah.
You don't want to talk about that because it has the Holywood connection.
Okay. So Paul's family lived in Garnival. We lived on the old Holywood Road. Our house became something of a cage, difficult to get out of because of where we were at that time. As part of this parish, there used to be a small Catholic church at Sydenham. The Church of Christ the King, is that right, Paul? Midnight Mass. You might have been, 15? I might have been 14, something like that. 14 or 13 maybe. The windows of the church come in during midnight mass. Father Farry's on the altar. And I remember him opening the door. Were you on the altar, Paul? No, you weren't at that. But Father Farry, opened the door. And I remember us as kids sitting there thinking, why is he opening the door? Is he mad? But anyway, when we got outside, all of the cars had been attacked as well. I think pretty much every window in the church came in, as I remember it. One of my younger sisters, she was 8 at the time, she said she thought she was going to die, and this was only speaking to her a number of months ago about all of that. Before the grills went on our window, Paul and his brother Mark and myself and Fergus, we played that game, Sabudio, the football game. Used to smooth it out on a rug or a carpet. I can remember the first night our windows came in. Manchester United were playing Everton in this Sabudio game. And my ma ran over the pitch. The two teams never recovered. I think she broke every player on the field, and no amount of whatever it was, that blooming Airfix glue or whatever it was we had at that stage, ever put those two teams back together again. It was the first time I met the UDA. That night the house was attacked, not that the church was attacked. they came to tell my mother that everything would be okay, that we had nothing to worry about. It wasn't them, they would look after us. But that period of intimidation just escalated. And, my dad, stubborn, nobody's going to put me out of my house, But that small Catholic community in that Knocknagunny, Garnival, Sydenham, neck of the woods at that stage, basically scattered at that time.
Seems very Harwood,
Yeah,
I actually had an absolutely shock when I was there.
yeah.
People that would speak on that was very.
And isn't the remarkable thing that we all survived that?
We all survived it.
That we all got out the other end of it, and that's something to be says a lot for that generation that was our parents.
Yeah.
How resilient they were, how they held us together, and my mother, still here most Saturday nights, still listens to the news and tells me, don't you be getting involved in that. I'd say it's a bit bloody late. But it's and that's what I mean about the remarkable journey that we've been on, that we come out of that yes, we've all got memories and ghosts and questions and all the rest of it, but with a bit of imagination, a bit of goodwill, I think we can get to the next stage. I really hate when people say to me nothing's changed. I know what I reported from that week of the Shankill bomb to Greysteel. I wasn't home. I was on the Shankill Road the day of the bomb. I'd been in that office on numerous occasions talking to loyalists. I remember there was always this kind of stench when you went into it, and I never associated it with the fish shop until the day of the bomb. And those are the other things you think about. That kind of what if question. What if it had happened some other time? What if it had happened when I was there? But what I find quite often is that people who suffered the most are prepared to, borrow your word, forgive the most in where we're trying to get to. And it is really people who should know better and who know little of that conflict period who should watch their words at this stage and be a little bit careful about what they're saying. I think it's over. The wars are over. The conflict is over. But I would hate to see another generation of young people end up in jail because we failed to do the easier bit of a hard process. So let's see where we go. Thanks very much for coming out to see me tonight. I appreciate it.